at the real high level, I got two offers. I think it was within the same day, actually, within a couple of hours of each other, the offers came in. And they were pretty good timing from personal standpoint. But it was within 2 or 3 weeks that we started working. And one was for a director of products. So essentially like a promotion where I have a team, pretty big uplift in pay as well. In sort of terms of the increase, it was including salary and bonuses, like 50K increase, which is pretty substantial for anybody, but it definitely makes a difference. And yeah, so it's, it may obviously make the case for if that's the outcome that your service provides, which was what I was hoping for, then it makes the case a lot easier. What I started realizing is I was actively interviewing, applying to jobs, and I was making it to, first, second phase, but then there was I wasn't getting that final, either in the final round, or I was getting no response, or I was getting rejections, people saying, hey, we're passing on you, looking at another candidate. And I really just started to wonder, hey, maybe something's changed. I think the previous time I was in the job market was 2020, right when everything was everybody was hiring. And it started to make me, the conversation we had, that introduction conversation, started to make me think this could be what I'm missing as far as sort of a competitive advantage to, me versus other people that are interviewing. Why am I not getting the offers? Because somebody else is. And obviously there's more.
Someone's getting the job.
Competition. Yeah, someone's getting the job, and there's more competition. So how do you separate yourself? So immediately when I implemented that, the difference in those interviews was pretty clear, right from the level of the person's, verbal and physical reaction, to the fact that I was getting more, follow-ups.
Cool. All right. So I'm here with Bill Masseur, one of my clients who went through the program a couple months ago, and Bill's been kind enough to decide to take the time to kind of chat about his experience and let you guys know his thoughts. So Bill, thanks for taking the time, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Alex. I'm excited to share my experience working with you, and excited to dive into it.
Yeah, awesome, man. I know it's been a couple of months since we last spoke, and since you started your new job. How's everything going, man?
It's going great. It's the whole process really helped me sort of take the next step in my career. So it's been challenging from that standpoint, but at the same time, it's really exciting, and it's where I need to be, where I'm growing, and where the opportunities are. So it's really exciting, and has a lot to do with your help in that process.
Yeah, awesome, man. I appreciate that. Cool. Why don't we dive in? Would you mind giving any people who are watching a bit of background information about yourself, and kind of let them know a bit about your work expertise and what you specialize in? Sure.
I might be a little rusty, having not interviewed for a couple of months, but I'll do my best.
That's all right, man.
So I've got about 15 years experience, sort of work experience, and the last 10 of those have been focused on B2B technology product management. So I've worked on the East Coast and some other sort of mid or companies on the West Coast as well, but mainly around B2B software and hardware. And then some of the industries I've worked in is business intelligence, HR software. Currently, I'm working in field service software. But mostly I focus on B2B product management.
Yeah, fantastic. And so before we started working together, what was your career situation like? What were you, what was the reason that you were actually looking for a job in the first place?
Yeah, so unfortunately, like a lot of people in tech, I was part of a layoff or reduction in force at the previous company I was at. So at that time, I was a senior product manager, and so yeah, was needing to. Yeah, I had personal situation, right? I've got kids, and wife is actually pregnant as well, so wasn't a very convenient time to have that happen from a lot of different standpoints. So a lot of pressure from my standpoint and a lot of urgency to solve that and find work and get a paycheck, one, but I think I also wanted to make sure that it was a better opportunity if I could do that, not just take a job because I have to. Like I might have had to have done that, but try to create the ideal situation and really find a better opportunity. So I think what and I don't know if we're going to get into this, but I think part of the reason what I started realizing is I was actively interviewing, applying to jobs, and I was making it to first, second phase, but then there was like I wasn't getting that final, either in the final round, or I was getting no response, or I was getting rejections, people saying, "Hey, we're passing on you, looking at another candidate." And I really just started to wonder, like, hey, maybe something's changed. I think the previous time I was in the job market was like 2020, right when everything was everybody was hiring and things were a lot more.
Companies were just trigger happy to hire people, right? It was just like a war for talent, and everyone had crazy budgets and interest rates were low. So companies put on a whole bunch of debt in order to capitalize on the fact that everyone was going remote. And
exactly.
Yeah. And but yeah, so I mean, this time around, just for a bit of context, like a lot of the stock market's obviously done a bit of a correction from what was happening in the previous years and from the boom from COVID, especially in tech. And a lot of these large companies who like Amazon and Facebook and whatnot, who increased their headcount massively, right, by like 30%. What happened is a lot of those companies laid off all this extra fat, so to speak, and there was just thousands of candidates looking for jobs, right? And so and then everyone was now super cautious, and instead of just hiring people and thinking, okay, this person I think is probably pretty good, could probably do the job, everyone started to get a little bit more cautious and very selective about the people that they were hiring. So that was totally, I wasn't at one of these larger tech companies, but on a smaller scale, that's exactly what happened. I was definitely hired with a lot quicker, than even had previously been my experience. So then coming into this job search, there was some adjustment. So yeah, when you reached out to me, it started to make me, the conversation we had, that introduction conversation started to make me think like, this could be what I'm missing as far as sort of a competitive advantage to, me versus other people that are interviewing. Why am I not getting the offers? Because somebody else is. And obviously there's more. Someone's getting the job.
Competition. Someone's getting the job, and there's more competition. So how do you separate yourself? I think especially coming from a product management background, I've sort of like now look at job searches as a bit of like you're trying to find the right fit for, it's like a market need. So how do you reverse engineer that? So it felt like there was something missing in my overall pitch and how I was approaching, especially the interviews.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that. We'll definitely go a little bit deeper in a second, but just in a quick snapshot for anyone. If you could kind of like summarize what were the results of working with me?
So at the real high level, I got 2 offers. I think it was within the same day, actually, within a couple of hours of each other, the offers came in, and they were pretty good timing from personal standpoint. But it was within 2 or 3 weeks that we started working. And one was for a director of products, so essentially like a promotion where I have a team, pretty big uplift in pay as well. And then the other one was a part-time role with sort of like a future promise of being a promotion. So still great opportunity. Just, I ended up obviously choosing the director of product role. But yeah, two great opportunities with really good companies. And especially in the market that I was in, I have friends, former coworkers who were also laid off with me, who are still searching for, the next job. And we're 5 months from when that layoff happened. So the fact that within 2 months, 3 weeks of talking to you, but 2 months post layoff, that I was able to start, not only have an offer, but start working. I'm pretty grateful for you.
Yeah, man. No, you're absolutely welcome. And honestly, it was fantastic to see, right? Like I remember like going through it, you pretty much just sponged up everything I said, you just immediately implemented, and you were like, yeah, I can already see the results. And it was just kind of awesome to see. I would like to touch on the compensation a little bit, if you are comfortable sharing. Are you comfortable sharing kind of, what that uplift looked like?
Yeah, I think in sort of terms of the increase, it was including salary and bonuses, like 50K increase, which is pretty substantial for anybody, but it definitely makes a difference. So it's, it may obviously makes the case for if that's the outcome that your service provides, which was what I was hoping for, then it makes the case a lot easier.
Yeah. 100%, right? Yeah. I mean, from an ROI perspective, right? That's, at the bare minimum, that's like a 10 times ROI in the first year. Right. And then following years, and, automatically it makes a lot of sense. Right. So,
well, the other thing too, I talked with other companies who similar service, but more, I think your service, you're a lot more focused. It's a lot more personal. This one was like a company that did this. And I was sort of astonished by what they were charging for. I believe at the time it was like 20K per year for a couple of years.
Wow.
So, so that was one of them where
I need to up my prices, it seems like.
Well, when I was comparing, sort of apples to apples, I'm like, well, Alex here seems like, I don't know how to describe it. You've got more of the street smarts of what's going on in the recruiting space. And, you yourself, the communication aspect is you're good at. So that stood out to me, versus this company where it felt like I was going through a program. I wasn't very sure who actually was going to teach that program.
Just kind of felt like a bit of a generic sales pitch, right?
Yeah. It definitely was a no. I think I did the first call with both of you, and it was like a no-brainer that I needed to move forward with your offer.
Well, I appreciate that, man. Do you remember, was there anything specific that stood out about, because obviously when we first spoke, I was kind of speaking about, strategies and maybe kind of like where you were going wrong, but, was there anything specifically that I mentioned that you remember that really stood out and really resonated with you as to why you decided to move ahead with me?
It's been a couple months, so I might not remember the exact details, but I felt like it was, I'll give one example that maybe came up later in our trainings, right? You talked about that first interview, right? With, it could be like a HR person or a recruiter. It felt like you understood how to make that. There's like a social human connection aspect to those interviews, which is like a sales thing. It's not necessarily, I don't think everybody walks into an interview and thinks this way. I think it's, you have that way of thinking because this is what you do. And obviously you realize that recruiting and hiring is a sale. So having that little insight, right? When and this was post the first talk with you, but I think in the first talk, I could sense that you understood details of the hiring process and you had experience around it, where if I could get that insight, it would help me close these deals. That was the sense that I got from talking to you. So, and then, like the example I'm giving, I think you mentioned like, hey, that first conversation with the recruiter, you want to bring up, look at their LinkedIn and find something interesting to bring up, right? And might not have anything to do with the job, but you're trying to create like a rapport. And it just seemed like people usually talk about the weather, but that just seems very lame and not very productive. But
you jump on a call and you're like, oh, how's the weather going? Like where you are, right? So like, and no,
this was more personal in it. Even though I didn't get an offer for that role, one of the interesting things was that person sent me a very detailed email of why I didn't get the role and how much they appreciated my, why they liked me and why they're going a different route. But I feel like it moved me up. If I wouldn't have had your advice, I probably would have either not made it to the next step, or they would have never given me that type of response even. So I wouldn't even have a shot is what I'm getting at.
I think from memory as well, so what we did was we scheduled that first coaching session like immediately before that first interview, right? And I was kind of like going through and I was like, hey, like, I know this sounds like it's super basic, but this is what you should do in order to be able to connect. And then we also went over some more strategies in terms of like how to speak about your background and align it to the role. And I remember, we were on a bit of a time crunch because obviously, we just started working together and we're like, I got a whole bunch of interviews coming up. So I was like, all right, let's, put the big boy pants on. Let's go. And we schedule a whole bunch of stuff really quickly. But I remember actually you saying how quickly you notice a difference in terms of like the response on the responsiveness in the interviews and how well they.
You made me think something that I would compare it to like hiring a personal trainer, right? Like I could go to the gym and figure stuff out, but if I pay somebody who knows exactly, right, has that experience, can give me those little details around how to do an exercise, how to eat well, like all the other things that help create the results you want. I really feel like once I hired you, like to your point, you jumped right in and you were supplementing. It's like you saw me doing certain things and you said, hey, I want to help you optimize, right? You could have.
It wasn't like your practice. I wasn't taking you from like, 0 to 1 kind of thing, right? Like you already had a fairly decent resume and you were already kind of getting interviews, but it was kind of like, sitting down and understanding, through our conversations, I was like, all right, these are the little levers, I think, based on how you're communicating with me. I feel like this is where, if we tweak a few of these things, that's where you're really going to start to get some results. And, we kind of, without going too much into the secret sauce, right? We kind of went into how to kind of position yourself and set yourself up for success and kind of, really get you to a point where you feel like they're bought in, they really value you as a candidate, and they're kind of trying to sell you the role a little bit as well. So how did you kind of notice and feel that difference when we, with the stuff that I was teaching?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I realized after some of our coaching, right, because I think as soon as I signed up, we did like 3 or 4 hours within first couple of days of like interview coaching, which was super, super helpful. And I think the challenge I had, right, when you have a couple of years experience, you can sort of get caught in a lot of different rabbit holes about what you're, and that's not relevant to the job. So I think what you helped me was like, well, how do you like high level summarize what you've worked on that's relevant to that job, that tells a story that relates to what they're looking to solve. So immediately when I implemented that, the difference in those interviews was pretty clear, right? From the level of the person's, verbal and physical reaction to the fact that I was getting more, follow-ups. I think it it was pretty immediate. And then I also felt like, it's hard when you're interviewing, and reality is usually you're going to apply for a whole bunch of jobs. So it's just a lot of rejection in general, right? There's very few people apply for a job and get every single job, right? That's probably not common. So it's hard to keep a proper perspective on keep yourself positive around your own background, because you start to doubt yourself. Like, is my background not impressive enough? Is it not important? Like, is it not relevant enough? And it's refreshing to have almost like that, that analogy of like the personal trainer sort of pushing you to get that extra rep and that extra little push to be like, hey, just keep at it.
Dash your technique this tiny little bit, and you're like, oh, hang on, suddenly starts to work, and
and then also to have somebody that can be honest with you, right? Where you're live on a call and you answer a question, and then you come back and say, hey, this was great, but you need to tighten this up and let's do that again. It's because it is a sale. So I think for somebody like me that's maybe more analytical, right, type, like especially a lot of people in technology are, and if you're not in sales, then these type of conversations are even more helpful. That type of training is even more helpful. Yeah,
absolutely, man. I would, I definitely like to go a little bit more into terms of like, your new job and what that kind of represents to you, right? So, you've been there for a couple of months now. How has the experience been? And, does it, from a career perspective, what does it kind of represent to you?
Well, it's been pretty big. Like, I had done a management type role like a couple of years ago, and then I left that company, went back to individual contributor. And I think there's paths, people could be successful being individual contributor, but I did feel like I added more value when I was in these type of management roles where I had a team. And I genuinely think maybe lacking a bit humility. I feel like I'm a good person to work for. I'm not trying to build a fiefdom. I want to help people grow. So what this job has done is really put me back into that role. And it's, put a little maybe confidence boost, a little pep in my step. Like, it's been exciting. I've had at this job, I think not even 2 months in, I had a meeting. Our CTO, our CPO flew out to our office, and I was in there making the case for what we should do 2 months in, and they sent a follow-up. We've got like a recognition software where you can get like, people can recognize you. So CPO recognized me and said like it was amazing how much I had learned and be able to articulate within 2 months. So it's just really cool, right? You put yourself in a new position where, 6 months before I was more individual contributor. Obviously, I was part of a layoff, so it couldn't have been going too great. Where now I feel like I'm, an essential part of this company, and I'm using my talents are being put to maybe even beyond my capabilities. Like it's a bit, it's not.
Feels like a bit of a stretch, right?
Yeah, but it's, to your question, it's like, is this the job where I probably have the biggest opportunity for growth out of all the opportunities? It probably was. So it's really exciting. I think a lot of people in their career, you reach certain points where you're discouraged, or you're like, am I going to move on from this type of role and get a bigger opportunity? And so I think, working with you, and obviously the person, you have to put effort into it too, right? As great as the coach you are, the person still has to put the effort and do the interviews and apply. And so I think it worked out really great. And I think it's put me in a position where, the outlook for my career now is, I'm excited for what I'm doing now and for what could come of it. So.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And yeah, man, it's always tough when you're in that situation where you're going through a job search and you don't want to settle, right? Like you want to be able to like pick a role that's going to represent growth to you, right? But unfortunately, a lot of people aren't, especially in the market right now, aren't able to do that, right? Simply because there's just so much, there's not as much roles happening. Everyone's super cautious, and there's a ton of people looking for work. It's awesome to see, man. And I remember, when we had conversations kind of when you first started, you were don't bite my hand off, but you said you felt like maybe you bit off a little bit more than you could chew, and you were saying like there's a few problems and that kind of thing. So it's really awesome to see that everything's going really well, and you've just taken to it. And it sounds like everything's kicking off, and it sounds like it's really made a big junction in your career, which is awesome to see from my end. So
yeah, well, I think too, the feedback that you provided, which was, I don't know, I think, like I said, there's a lot of rejection involved with the interview process. So when I would answer the questions properly, like, and you were excited, it made me more confident walking into those things, right? Like, obviously, you're not the hiring manager, but it's an outsider that has knowledge of the process, that is familiar with these type of roles, that it gives you some confidence of, walking into those meetings, like feeling like, hey, you know what, my answers are going to be, I'm the right person. And I know how to talk about myself appropriately and effectively. And it's a hard thing to do, right? It's like having self-awareness and being able to talk about yourself is sometimes really difficult for a lot of people, including myself.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, it's something we don't normally do in our day-to-day role, right? We just kind of, we don't talk about what we do for a job and how great we are. We just get on with it and we do the job, right? And so, when it's time to go on like a job search, a lot of people will have, rely on their network, or, a lot of their job titles will kind of do the heavy lifting for them. But, when it's a really tough market, and like you say, you don't have like a referral coming through, then sometimes it can be tough to, hone that interview skill, but just because you don't really use it that often, right? And then that's where somebody like me can really, me and the program obviously that I built can really come in and make a difference. So, yeah. I want to be conscious of your time, man, but I do have a couple more questions, if that's cool. I just wanted to know, who would you recommend this program to, right?
So, and I feel like this is maybe a very broad answer, but honestly, even if knowing what I know now, even if I was earlier in my career, I would find a ton of value. Like, people can complain about the job process and resumes and LinkedIn, but like, that's just reality. So how are you going to deal with it? So in my mind, it's like the personal trainer analogy is actually very similar. It's actually much easier. I've seen people do it, right? Get into shape, right? Look at like celebrities with a personal trainer. So when I think about like the time when I'm ready to do my next career move, like I actually feel like I missed out on some of what you could have done, because we never even started from scratch, where I feel like it could have been even a whole different opportunity. So to me, it's like, if you have the resources to do it, right? And it's not like we talked about some other competitors where it's even crazier price. The ROI is really clear. Definitely if you're someone mid-career, like I was, senior, and you're having trouble, right? Like I know people that I've recommended that have ended up signing up for your service. Like if you're having trouble finding something, you're not sure what that missing piece is. I think it's really difficult. It's going to be hard to find that out on your own, because, a lot of companies aren't not honest. They're very,
they're not forthcoming. Right.
It's very rare that they're willing to give that feedback for a lot of reasons. So having somebody who can coach you, give you that honest feedback, and really, answer questions around like, hey, I haven't gotten a response from this recruiter. Here's what we last talked about. What do you think I should respond with? Right. it's like having someone like tactically there with you to think how those things through. So, I think as someone, if you're, your career, your technology professional, I would totally recommend it. Just as a way to get an edge, right? Because interviewing, at the end of the day, you could be, you're a designer, you could be a fantastic designer, but if you can't speak to the work that you've done and why and how you can make a difference at that company, like, I think what you helped me understand was like that missing, because it's hard during, you're in a layoff and you're thinking about everything
bills and this, and am I apply to different jobs, and am I going to have to do this, and
you're very internally focused on all the why you need a job, and so having the proper perspective of like what is the company actually looking for, and what are certain questions that I need to answer satisfactorily, right? Am I a culture fit? Am I a fit from a competency? And I feel like the approach that you teach actually helps preempt. I think that was the other thing I realized. Like, I have another part of my history is I've got like a couple jobs where I've spent not much, a year or so. So it looks like I was job hopping. And so when I brought that up to you as, hey, this could be one of the reasons, you were like, well, preempt that, talk to your story, tell them how you want to be there long term, right? Which is the truth.
So
I think what those insights that you had.
I believe I call the strategy play chess, not checkers, right? Like you gotta set up a defense, and you essentially have to position yourself so that when those those concerns which are going to come up, those questions, right? You're basically answering that through layering that through your communication, right? Which is a lot more honest signal, from your end, that they're generally going to trust a lot more than if they say, hey, they ask about this and you say, oh, no, don't worry about it, right? Because you might just be,
I think that's totally maybe the biggest takeaway out of all of that I learned from you is like, the more that you position yourself as solving those needs where the person, the first thought they get is they're checking boxes versus there's questions that come up. The less of those questions and the more of the boxes checked, the more you are the right person for the job. I think
everything just lines up, right? And and,
it's crazy because I thought like, hey, I'm the same person that I was on this previous interview, similar job, but just the way that I position myself, how I talk to maybe some things that could have been concerns preemptively, made a huge difference.
Yeah, man, 100%. And I'm glad you broke that down, because I'd kind of forgotten about that, because I remember that was a big key thing that I taught. And again, same thing. As soon as we implemented it, you came back and you're like, man, it was just like immediately I felt like they would, they connected, and then they were trying to starting to sell me. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. That's how it should be.
I think what, I realized that maybe that was an issue. And what the reason I realized it, some interviewers brought it up, right? They would ask me outright, like, hey, why did you move around so much? Explain that. And then some would never, but I think what you want to realize as a person interviewing is like, what are those things that people could be concerned about? And then how do you almost answer those preemptively with the right answer, which positions you as the right person for the job. And so I think the people that weren't asking were already probably thinking it. And so the fact that I pre-addressed it, they would have never asked it in the alternative. Now I gave them an answer. So you didn't even have a chance, because if you didn't address it, they just went away thinking, oh, well, this person job hopped. You know what? That's not.
It's just something they're like, it's just something they're kind of thinking about. They may not voice the concern, but it's always kind of like an element of their intuition in their gut, right? But then when you answer those questions, whether they state it or whether they're thinking it or whatever, but if they come to the conclusion to that answer, right, without you being super obvious about it, that's when everything starts to line up, and then those decisions to hire someone are less conflicted, and then start to become super aligned, right? Because it's very clear through your communication exactly who you are, and then they all trust basically the the impression that they've gotten from you because of the way that you presented it, right?
Well, to answer your question,
Mm.
because I think we sort of went on a tangent, but
Yeah.
get back to your question of, who's this for? If I really think about when I made the decision,
Mhm.
like especially if you're laid off, like a week's salary would probably pay even more than what your service is. So if you're making over 150K, something like that, like a week's having this process go on, right? You looking for a job for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, there's a cost to that. So that was the way I looked at it, was like, I'm already doing some things right. I've got a pretty good background. I need somebody to come in and help me get an advantage. And if I do that quickly, whatever I pay this person is not even going to really matter, because it's better to have a job 3 weeks sooner than 3 weeks later, because that's $10,000, whatever it is. So, I think sometimes people are resistant to, like, and I fall into that category too, to pay for sort of coaching services. And I think what I realized here was like, well, it's a primary source of income. And if I can get this a week sooner, the other thing I thought was like, it's all about momentum, right? If I get 2 offers, now I've got people competing for me. So that, not only did it happen sooner, now I might get more because I've got more leverage in the job offer process, or the negotiation process. And that was true. Like, I know part of what my increase, I negotiated higher with your help. So even if you wanted to just look at what I negotiated on the increase and attribute some of that to your help, it already justifies the price of the program.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%, man. And I appreciate you saying that. I didn't want to kind of like go too much into the negotiation, because I know sometimes people don't want to kind of speak about that. But I appreciate you being forthcoming with that. So again, wrap up in a sec, man. But if someone's kind of like on the fence about the program, what would you say to them?
I would have them think through some of the things I just said, like the time aspect, and think about where they're at, right? Like, we talked a lot about the interviewing, but towards the tail end, right? We were focused on the interviewing, but you actually helped update my resume. We were going to start sort of the proactive, me reaching out, like building up like my own leads of ideal companies. So, I think your program you're thinking through the whole process. So even if you're a great interviewer, but your resume stinks, and I think you were really good at it, helping improve that. And that made a big difference. Or if you're looking to, I don't know, I like thinking that, especially in this market where it's more competitive, it just adds to the reason to hire somebody to help like this. Because, I don't have a big brand on my resume. And I think a lot of people, that makes it easier in some cases. Maybe I'm making up a reason, but since I didn't have that, it made me feel like I need another advantage. I can't just depend on my background, my experience. I've got to really be on my, P's and Q's and make sure I'm like presenting myself well. And so I just find that hard unless you're a salesperson, I find it really hard that somebody who's just looking for a job is going to be up on all that. So to me, it's like, this is your career. You're trying to optimize what your growth is. You're trying to optimize what you're going to make. It's just really an investment, like in yourself and in your career and your future.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Is there anyone that you wouldn't recommend this to?
Well, I would say, if you're not, like I said before, if you're not going to put the effort to implement what you're saying, there's a bit of trust aspect too. Like, we never got to get into it, but like some of the stuff that you were recommending around, like how to get those more cold leads and those type of opportunities. I was going to do it, even though I was a little hesitant. So my main point is like, I think you've got to be willing to put in the effort, and you've got to sort of say, hey, this person knows what they're doing and knows the process, and I need to just listen, take advice, be receptive to the feedback. Right. It's not, it's not comfortable even during some of the training sessions where somebody tells you, hey, your answers was bad, or and you were very, polite in how you said it, but it's still frustrating. You're like, okay, great. I've got to, but at the end of the day, the goal is to try to get better and to try to make sure you have the best opportunity. So you got to be open to feedback. If you're not open to feedback and you're not willing to, have a lot of these conversations, and then I wouldn't, invest the money. But, I think most people, professionals, especially in tech, you wouldn't survive very long if that was the case. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. I think you're bang on 100%. The people that get the best results of this program, the people who just kind of put aside their reservations or basically hang up any kind of preconceived notion about how it should be or the right way to do things, and then just try and implement. And that's exactly what you did. And it was like, it was almost like a light bulb. It was almost like night and day, like boom. And then everything just started flowing. And which is why I think, this testimonial kind of makes such a great kind of case study for what, what is possible if you just, just dive, go 100% in, trust the process, and, trust somebody who knows what they're doing to handle it. And it was also amazing to see as well as a coach, I obviously, work with a lot of people, and I'll teach them a lot of stuff, and, everyone generally gets some good results, but the people that I really like to work with are the ones that can really just go all in and hang up their reservations and, not have one foot on the brake and just have both foot on the accelerator. And then, the end result is, 2 weeks, 2 offers, promotion, the director of product management, and, an extra 50K in comp. So, it was fantastic to see, man. So, I appreciate it. No stress.
We make a great team. So
we do, brother. We do. Yeah. I wish there was some kind of way that we could keep working together. But maybe we'll figure about that. Maybe I'll need a director of product management at some point.
Yeah. Exactly.
But cool, man. Well, I'll let you go in a second. Any kind of final thoughts or anything before we wrap this up?
Yeah, if I know the purpose of this is like for people looking into working with you. So I would say, if you're questioning, like, ask Alex the questions, right? I think that was part of my process. I went into it not expecting, that I would even do the program, and then was impressed by talking to you. And then I asked you questions, and your answers made sense to me. So I would say, sort of take Alex to task and ask him the question that you have. And I think you'll see that he knows this problem and he's solved it before. So, but the other thing I would say is, right, if you do go ahead with it, like exactly what you said, just commit to it, put the effort. And to me, the results is, I'm very grateful that it was, the situation I was in, that I could apply myself and then turn it into a positive, especially in this market. It's been a real blessing. So,
yeah, fantastic, man. Awesome, Bill. Well, I appreciate you taking the time with this, man. And to anyone who's kind of watching this, and you're listening to this and you kind of resonate, and you feel like some of the stuff that Bill says really made sense, and you can kind of put yourself in his shoes. Appreciate you taking the time, and I would encourage you to, explore the option and, ask the questions of me and see if it does make sense for you and myself and any of my future team to work together to see if we can solve this problem for you. But thanks, Bill. I really appreciate it, man.
Thank you.